Okay, so service oriented architecture. So ठीक है, do not confuse this with SOAP, which is simple object access protocol. This is related to services, and that is related to as to how information is communicated um, on the internet, not on the internet, but it's basically the exchange of information on a distributed environment, decentralized environment, right? So anyways, so service oriented architecture, it is distributed object systems have जो distributed object systems होते हैं ना, उसके अंदर usually मसले होते हैं distributed systems के अंदर ऑब्जेक्ट को रिफ्लेक्ट करना काफ़ी मुश्किल होता है, ठीक है, एज पर योर कस्टमर रिक्वायरमेंट्स एंड बिजनेसेस. तो इसी सिनेरियोज़ के अंदर सर्विसेज बहुत ज़्यादा हेल्पफुल होते हैं बिकॉज दे कैन अडेप्ट टू डिफरेंट कॉम्प्लेक्स businesses, divisions, and all of the intricacies, क्योंकि आपने basically ये बोला कि एक division के लिए आपने एक service provide कर दी. It allows you to build applications from new services, ठीक है, या तो आप applications new services बनाते हैं या तो आप बनाते हैं from the old services or the applications wrapped as services. So जो है आपके पास is important when application have to cross trust boundaries. Right, so I'm not sure about that. Let's move forward. Object technology can be used for implementing services, web services. Object technology भी use कर सकते हैं for creating services, but mainly हम web services use कर रहे हैं for creating SOA. And services are basically independent of each one another and they have a separate interface. So ASP.NET जो है web services अपनी web services provide करता है, वो basically built on top of on the ASP.NET, which allows you to use many of the functionalities of ASP.NET, such as its authentication, caching, tracing, and state management, right? So authentication, caching, state management, tracing. So ये हमारे पास एक एप्लीकेशन है, बेसिकली बता रहे हैं कि वेब सर्विसेज कैसे क्रिएट होती हैं. सो जो अंडरलाइन स्ट्रक्चर है, तो आपके पास एक वेब सर्विस प्रॉक्सी है फॉर .NET ऐप ऑन योर विंडोज़, ऑन योर लिनक्स एंड ऑन योर मैक. और ये बेसिकली कनेक्टेड हुआ है HTTP एंड XML से. ये आपके पास वेब सर्वर A है, ये आपके पास वेब सर्वर B है, यहाँ पे XML की वेब सर्विस है, यहाँ पे आपके पास वेब सर्विस प्रॉक्सी है. सो ये मेन है एंड दिस इज़ योर बेसिकली प्रॉक्सी, एंड देन यू आर कम्युनिकेटिंग सम ब्राउज़र एंड एनी प्लेटफॉर्म थ्रू दिस, राइट. सो यू कैन से कि इसमें सारी की सारी आ रही हैं फ्रॉम डिफरेंट प्लेटफॉर्म्स. ये चल रहा है आपके पास वेब सर्वर एज एन XML वेब सर्विस, और इसकी हमने प्रॉक्सी बनाई हुई है, एंड देन सम ब्राउज़र कैन एक्सेस इट. नेक्स्ट लेट्स टॉक अबाउट रेस्ट वर्सेस सोप. तो हमने अभी जो भी बात कर रहे थे वो सोप की वेब सर्विसेज पे बेस्ड था, ठीक है. सो सोप का बेसिकली अंडरलाइन स्ट्रक्चर क्या है फॉर एन फोन बुक क्वेरी, दैट वुड बी सम एनवेलप, सम बॉडी, राइट, बिकॉज हेडर इज़ ऑप्शनल. यहाँ पे हमने मैसेज के बजाय हमने PB से डिनोट कर रहे हैं. देन यू हैव योर बेसिकली योर लिंक, एंड देन यू हैव योर गेट यूज़र्स, एंड देन यूज़र ID 1 2 3 है, हमें 1 2 3 का बेसिकली वो चाहिए, क्या कहते हैं उसकी फ़ोन बुक, उसका फ़ोन नंबर चाहिए, and then you're basically ending all of the closing tags. However, if you're using REST APIs, then for that आपके पास होता है क्या है कि you have your link which is similar to what we had over there, but instead of that we also have the user details which is this one. So instead of get user, basically इस method का हमने नाम रख दिया user details, and then the value of the user ID that you want. So over here this is 1 2 3, and we're assuming that it only has one element, which is the reason why we're using 1 2 3. If it had multiple elements, then you would write question mark from the user details, question mark, first name equals to this and last name equals to that, so on and so forth. Now we have the get request. तो get request basically यही कर रहा है कि you have this entire website over here, and then you have HTTP 1.1, the host, which is going to be the initial part of that website, and accept equals to application slash. Okay, so over here you're going to give the entire path, and over here you're just going to give the partial path, and then over here you're saying that it should be accepting an application of XML data type, data format, message data format. Then example 2 is, I've explained this. Now let's talk about REST. So REST basically आपके पास architectural principles हैं, they were given by Roy Fielding. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. So Roy Fielding, I guess. Okay, so there are two important principles. The first one was addressable resources, which basically means that it is service oriented, and that it is resource oriented, and that each resource must be addressable via URI. So हम ये basically यहाँ पे जो URI देख रहे थे, ये URI था, unique reference index. So we have your host, your port, and basically if you're using a local host, then you would have localhost colon 5000, but if you're using a website, then you have some DNS and then its path, right? And the second principle is uniform contained interface, which means you're using the same web methods, and the methods over here would be like HTTP methods such as get, put, delete, etc., to manipulate your resources. So let's take a look at your HTTP request and response as REST. We've looked at the request part earlier, but to do a quick recap, we have some path. So resource, this is the method get, and you have HTTP 1.1, you have the host, you have accept. It can be message, could be either in XML or it could be in JSON, and then you have your response, which is going to be HTTP 1.1 200 OK date server, which is basically कौन से server से तुम response आ रहा है, the content type. Again, this is going to be application XML, char set equals to UTF-8, and then you have your entire XML ka part over here as a response, because it was accepting the return part. The response was basically application XML, but if this was JSON, then the return part would also be JSON over here. So some constraints, right? So the constraints that we have in REST are basically we want a client server to have separation of concerns, which means we want the client to be separated from the server. We are going to have client stateless. So I haven't talked about this yet. So before I go on this, I should be talking about this diagram. So we have client state 1 and we have client state 2. So it's the same client with different states. And states over here could be like, has my client logged in? Has it not logged in? Basically, have I added something to my cart or not? Right? So these are all states that you can think of, the values, the data that a certain client has, right? Now, state less basically means that all of these states are going to be saved at the client side and not at the server side, which basically means that you're storing this via cookies, via authentication tokens, and all of that stuff. However, stateful basically means that you're storing all of these states on the server, and yeah, that's basically it. So you're basically getting some information from the REST web servers, and then you are returning the response, which is basically the XML data representation state. Now, coming back to over here, but before that I go over there again. Just know that I'm just going to tell you this very basic diagram. So you have client and you have a server, right? And let's say you have some intermediate, let's say you have a router. So this is like just one jump towards the server side. So we're going to be talking about a concept about caching, right? So let's say that the server over here has the database and you want to get something from the database, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to first go to your router, which is going to be a DNS, and then you're going to fetch the information from the server. Now the server is going to return the information back to the client, and it's going to have, for example, let's say it is retrieving the phone book, right? So in this phone book, it will have a field called last modified over here, and over here when you're going to get your response data, it's also going to have another field which is going to be last modified. Now this last modified and this last modifieds are different, because this last modified is basically telling when was this particular phone book updated in the database, and this last modified is basically telling you when was the last time or last modified message that you got from the server. So these are two different things. Now imagine that the client wants to retrieve this information again, so it will first look at its own so I think no first it's going to look at its own yeah, so let me do this again. So let's assume that the client wants this phone book query, right? So it's going to go to the router, it's going to go to the server, and it's going to look at, okay, so this last modified hasn't changed. It's going to go back and it's going to say, hey, do I already have this message or not? I have this message, so just show that message. Otherwise it would then take the message back to the client, right? However, if this message was updated, then this would first change its server basically अपने आप पे change करेगा, and then it would go to the client, right? तो फिर ये वाली चीज़ भी चेंज हो जाएगी. सो कहने का मकसद ये है कि क्लाइंट अपने पास ये स्टोर कर रहा है कि उसके पास कब रिस्पॉन्स बेसिकली ये स्टोर कर रहा है कि अगर डेटाबेस चेंज नहीं हुआ और ये वाला मैसेज मेरे पास पहले से है तो मेरे पास वही शो कर दो, ठीक है. अगर मेरे पास ये वाला मैसेज नहीं है तो फिर पहले लेके आओ एंड देन शो दैट टू मी, राइट. और सर्वर अपने पास बेसिकली ये मेंटेन कर रहा है कि ये टेबल कब लास्ट टाइम चेंज हुआ था या नहीं हुआ था. और राउटर का काम यहाँ पे है कि राउटर डीएनएस जो होता है ये भी कैश रख रहा होता है. सो मे बी इंस्टेड ऑफ response over here, it can have a response over here, and then this response can come back over here. Okay, so that was caching. So the constraints are that for REST API, we want a client-server separation of concern. Second, we want stateless. We want to have caching for reducing latency. Stateless basically reliability के लिए है. Uniform interface, which was this part, which is the methods for simplifying the architecture. We have a layered system for like shared caching and improving extensibility. And then we have code on demand, which is basically simplifying client and improving extensibility. Sorry, the layered system was for shared caching, load balancing, and scalability. Okay, then we have WADC, which is basically stands for web application. No, it's not C, it's L. Sorry, this is L. So WADL, which basically stands for Web Application Descriptive Language. So what that basically means is, if you would look at the video on WASL, वहाँ पे हम बात कर रहे थे, sorry, WSDL. So WSDL was for Web Services Descriptive Language, and that was basically the descriptive language for the syntax, for the rules, for the grammar, for the parameters. That if a web service if there is a web service which is using SOAP, right, then there should be some grammar, some rules that it has to follow for it to be a web service. Similarly, over here we are saying that for an web API, we are using Web Application Descriptive Language, which is basically telling all of that. Then we have why API. So we need APIs to remove the problem of interoperability, which basically means that you can use your application, you can use your web API everywhere, right? Everywhere you want. You can use it on different applications, on different OS, on different programming languages, on different devices, all of that stuff, right? And API is basically a URL which can be accessed through any device, right? And it can support XML or JSON. Next we have is the HTTP verbs. So HTTP verbs are basically these verbs that we were talking about, the methods, the common methods that you need to use the common interface, right? So get is basically used to retrieve the data. So .com/customer1234. So get the information of 1234, and we're assuming the fact that there's only one parameter. Post is to submit something to the server, or basically causing a change of states on the server side, or basically अगर आपको कोई नई चीज़ add करनी है. So this is going to be .com/customers. Then put is to update any information. So this is very similar to here. And then delete to delete any information. Again, stateless, अगर हम terms of scalability बात करें, so it's very easier to scale because सारी information client के पास होती है. However, अगर stateful use कर रहे हैं तो हमारे पास एक dedicated server होगा जहाँ पे सारी information हम session की put कर रहे होंगे या store कर रहे होंगे. और अगर वो server down हो जाता है, then that information is lost and the client cannot access the server properly because it doesn't have the session information. Okay. So then let's talk about this very mini topic. I'll be going into detail in the next video. Proxy pattern. So proxy pattern क्या होता है आपके पास?